The Holloway Grand Hotel stood like a monument to another era, its towering facade of weathered stone framed against a dull gray sky. Marcus Weaver tightened his coat against the cold drizzle as he stepped out of the cab. The grandeur of the building should have been inviting, but something about it made him pause, a lingering unease he couldn't quite place. The doorman, an elderly man with an almost too wide smile, tipped his hat and held the door open. "Welcome to the Holloway Grand, sir. A night to remember, I'm sure." Marcus offered a polite nod and stepped into the lobby. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor, the space far quieter than he expected for such a massive hotel. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears, casting dim light on polished surfaces. Behind the front desk stood a woman in her late 30s, her demeanor professional but with an edge of detachment. "Good evening," Marcus said, setting his small suitcase on the counter. "I have a reservation." "Weaver, Marcus." The receptionist nodded, tapping at an ancient-looking computer. "Ah yes, room 214. Here's your key." She handed him a tarnished brass key attached to a heavy tag stamped with the room number. As he took the key, he couldn't help but notice her expression shift, a flicker of something that looked like hesitation. "Enjoy your stay," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. The hallway to his room was long and narrow, lined with faded wallpaper and flickering sconces. Marcus passed by doors that looked untouched, their brass numbers dulled with time. A faint mustiness clung to the air, the kind that spoke of damp corners and forgotten spaces. Room 214 was at the very end of the hall. Marcus inserted the key and turned it with a soft click. The door creaked open to reveal a surprisingly well-kept room. A neatly made queen bed, an ornate writing desk, and a small window overlooking the rain-soaked courtyard below. He set his suitcase by the bed and let out a sigh. The long day of travel had left him bone-tired. Yet, as he sat on the edge of the bed to untie his shoes, he noticed it again, that faint sense of unease. The room felt wrong. He couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the peculiar draft despite the window being shut, or the faint, rhythmic tapping sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the walls. He shrugged it off. "You're overthinking," he muttered to himself. Later that evening, Marcus headed back down to the lobby. The receptionist was gone, replaced by a younger man with a distracted air. Marcus asked for a map of the hotel, thinking it might help him plan his stay. The map was simple enough. 3 floors, each with a neat grid of rooms. As he studied it, something odd caught his attention. His room, 214, wasn't listed. The second floor's diagram jumped from 213 to 215, with no mention of the room he was staying in. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the receptionist. "I think there's a mistake on this map. My room isn't on here." The man looked up, his face suddenly tense. "Room 214? "Yes." The receptionist hesitated. I'm not sure. That map's old. Some parts of the hotel have been reconfigured over the years." "Reconfigured?" The explanation felt thin, but Marcus decided to let it go for now. He returned to his room, his curiosity gnawing at him. As the night deepened, Marcus found sleep elusive. The faint tapping sound he'd noticed earlier had grown louder, more distinct, as if someone were knocking on a hollow surface. He sat up in bed, his pulse quickening. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside his room. He followed the noise to the far wall, where a heavy wardrobe stood. Hesitant but driven by unease, he moved the piece of furniture aside, revealing a small, hidden door. Its wood was dark and scratched, with no knob, only a keyhole. His heart thumped in his chest as he knelt to examine it. Why would there be a door here, concealed behind a wardrobe? And more importantly, where did it lead? Marcus's thoughts raced as he retrieved the brass key from his pocket. It was a long shot, but something told him he had to try. The key fit perfectly. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. A cold draft wafted up, carrying with it the faint scent of damp stone and decay. Marcus hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to shut the door and push the wardrobe back into place. But curiosity, and something deeper, something almost magnetic, compelled him to step forward. He descended slowly, the air growing colder with each step. The walls of the stairwell were rough and uneven, etched with strange markings that looked almost like writing but didn't belong to any language he recognized. At the bottom, he reached another door, this one larger and more ornate. It was carved with intricate patterns, its surface cracked and aged. With trembling hands, Marcus pushed it open. The room beyond was massive, far larger than it should have been given the building's structure. Its walls were lined with dusty bookshelves and tattered drapery, and in the center stood a single wooden chair beneath a dim, flickering chandelier. On the chair sat a figure. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was gaunt and unnaturally pale, its head bowed as if in deep sleep. As Marcus stepped closer, the figure's head jerked upward, revealing hollow eyes that stared straight at him. And then it smiled. The figure in the chair remained still, its hollow eyes fixed on Marcus. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think, the unnatural stillness of the room pressing down on him. And then the smile widened. "Who?" Marcus began, his voice shaking. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question, then raised one bony finger to its lips. "Shoo!" it whispered, though the sound didn't come from its mouth. Instead, it echoed all around the room, a ghostly susurration that made Marcus's skin crawl. The air seemed to thicken, the faint flicker of the chandelier dimming further. Marcus took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to flee, but the door behind him had vanished. "Why are you here?" Marcus forced himself to ask, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure remained silent, but as Marcus stared, the room began to shift. The dusty bookshelves dissolved, replaced by scenes projected onto the walls like a flickering film reel. He saw the hotel as it had been decades ago, vibrant and full of life. Guests in elegant attire laughed and danced in the grand ballroom. Then the images grew darker. A shadowy figure moved through the crowd, unnoticed but deliberate. Guests began to disappear, one by one, until the ballroom stood empty. The scene changed again, now showing a young woman with wild eyes and a tattered dress being dragged through the lobby. She screamed, her voice raw with terror, as a group of men pushed her toward a basement door. They didn't listen, the figure in the chair whispered, its voice rasping. Marcus's heart raced. What didn't they listen to? The figure didn't answer, but the walls continued to show the woman's fate. She was chained to the very chair that now stood before Marcus, her screams echoing as the men locked her away. The final image burned into Marcus's mind. Her face twisted in anguish, her hollow eyes staring straight ahead. The room fell silent again, the oppressive darkness returning. The figure in the chair had vanished, leaving the space empty and cold. "Let me out," Marcus muttered, panic bubbling in his chest. He turned in frantic circles, searching for an exit. The tapping sound returned, louder now, echoing all around him. It was a deliberate rhythm, as if something or someone was knocking on the edges of reality itself. He pressed his hands against the walls, desperate to find a hidden door, a seam, anything. His fingers brushed against the markings he'd seen earlier, the strange symbols etched into the stone. As he touched them, the tapping stopped, and a voice, a woman's voice, whispered in his ear, "You opened the door. You can't leave now." Before Marcus could react, the wall in front of him cracked open, revealing another staircase. This one descended further, the darkness below seeming to swallow the faint light from the room. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I'm not going down there." But the whisper returned, insistent and laced with an unnatural edge. "You have no choice." Something unseen pushed him forward, his feet moving against his will. Step by step, he descended, the chill in the air deepening with every movement. The staircase spiraled endlessly, the walls narrowing until he felt as though they might crush him. At last, he emerged into another chamber, this one even more surreal than the last. The room was lined with mirrors, each one cracked and warped, reflecting distorted images of Marcus as he stepped inside. The air here was heavier, tinged with a metallic scent that turned his stomach. As he moved further in, the mirrors began to shift. His reflection no longer mimicked his movements but acted independently, staring at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Why am I here?" he demanded, his voice bouncing off the walls. One of the reflections answered, its lips moving out of sync with its words. "You shouldn't have come." Marcus turned to another mirror, where a different version of himself appeared. This one looked gaunt, his eyes sunken and his expression hollow. "You're part of it now," it said, its voice barely a whisper. The tapping sound returned, this time coming from behind one of the mirrors. It grew louder, more frantic, until the glass began to crack. Marcus stumbled backward as one of the mirrors shattered completely, revealing a tunnel beyond. He didn't want to go further, but something in the air, some unseen force, urged him on. The tunnel was tight, the walls damp and cold against his shoulders. The tapping grew fainter as he moved forward, replaced by a low hum that seemed to resonate through his bones. As he emerged from the tunnel, he found himself in yet another room. This one was different, brighter, with pale blue light emanating from an unseen source. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it rested a small, ornate box. Marcus approached cautiously, the hairs on his arms standing on end. The box was carved with the same strange symbols he'd seen before, its surface glinting faintly in the eerie light. The hum grew louder as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the box's surface. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over him, stretching impossibly tall across the walls. He turned, his blood running cold as he saw it. A figure, featureless and black as the void, standing just behind him. "Leave it," the shadow intoned, its voice reverberating through the room. But Marcus couldn't move, his hand frozen on the box. The shadow surged forward, and everything went black. When Marcus opened his eyes, he was lying on the cold, damp floor of the tunnel. The shadowy figure was gone, but the memory of its towering presence lingered, etched into his mind. His chest heaved as he struggled to steady his breathing, the suffocating silence around him amplifying his fear. The ornate box was still in his hand, its surface unnervingly warm to the touch. The symbols carved into it seemed to shift under the faint light, writhing like living things. He wanted to toss it away, but something about it compelled him to keep holding on. A voice whispered in the back of his mind, soft, insistent. "It's yours now." "Knows." Marcus pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, the blue light that had illuminated the room gone. He clutched the box tightly, unsure whether it was a lifeline or a curse. As he moved forward, the tapping sound returned, faint at first but growing louder with every step. It no longer seemed random, it had a deliberate rhythmic pattern. Marcus paused, pressing his ear against the cold wall. The sound was coming from behind it. "Is someone there?" he called, his voice echoing into the void. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a new noise, a low, guttural whisper that made his stomach churn. "You shouldn't have taken it." The voice rasped, disembodied and cold. Marcus stumbled back, clutching the box. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The whisper turned to laughter, cruel and mocking, before fading into the distance. Marcus's grip on the box tightened as he forced himself to press on, his steps quickening as the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around him. After what felt like hours, Marcus emerged from the tunnel and found himself back in the hidden room with the shattered mirrors. The pedestal in the center of the room was empty, the light that had once bathed it now replaced by shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls. The mirrors had changed. Where once they reflected twisted versions of himself, now they displayed scenes from the hotel's history, its halls bustling with life, its guests unaware of the darkness lurking beneath their feet. In one mirror, Marcus saw the young woman again, her wild eyes staring directly at him as if she could see through the glass. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice clear despite the barrier between them. Marcus stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Who are you? What happened to you?" Her gaze darkened, and her lips twisted into a grim smile. "I warned them, but they didn't listen." Now it's your turn. Before he could respond, the mirror shattered, the sound ringing in his ears. A new presence filled the room. A suffocating, malevolent energy that seemed to pulse with each beat of Marcus's heart. The shadowy figure reappeared, its form even darker and more imposing than before. "You cannot escape," it intoned, its voice a chorus of overlapping whispers. Marcus backed away, clutching the box. "What do you want from me?" The shadow extended an arm, its formless hand pointing to the box. "You have taken what was sealed. It binds you now. You will carry its curse, or you will perish." The weight of the box seemed to double in his hands. "What is this? What's inside?" The shadow loomed closer, its presence forcing Marcus to his knees. "Justice," it hissed. "Her justice." Before Marcus could react, the room shifted again. The mirrors repaired themselves, but instead of reflections, they now displayed vivid scenes of the past. He saw the young woman, the one he now recognized as the spirit haunting the hotel, standing in the lobby, pleading with a group of well-dressed men. Her voice trembled with desperation. "You must listen to me. The land is cursed. If you build here, it will consume you all." The men dismissed her, their laughter cruel and dismissive. "Enough of this nonsense," one of them said. "Remove her from the premises." The scene changed, showing the woman being dragged into the basement. Her screams echoed in Marcus's ears as the men bound her to the chair he had seen earlier. They accused her of witchcraft, of spreading lies to undermine their venture. Her final words before they sealed her away were a curse. "Your greed will destroy you. The land will never be yours. It will take and take until nothing remains." The mirrors went dark, and the shadowy figure loomed over Marcus once more. "You are bound to her fate now," it said. "The curse cannot be undone." Marcus looked down at the box, his hands trembling. The symbols on its surface glowed faintly, and a small latch clicked open. "No," he whispered, trying to resist the compulsion to look inside. But his hands betrayed him, lifting the lid. Inside was a small, black stone, smooth and cold to the touch. As Marcus picked it up, visions flooded his mind. Flashes of the woman's torment, the men's cruelty, and the countless others who had fallen victim to the curse since. The shadow's voice rang in his ears. "You are the keeper now. The box is your burden. The curse is your inheritance." The room began to collapse, the mirrors shattering and the walls crumbling into darkness. Marcus clutched the stone and the box, his mind racing. "What does this mean?" he shouted. "How do I stop this?" The shadow's laughter filled the void. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The curse is eternal." As the last of the room dissolved, Marcus felt himself falling, the cold grip of the shadow pulling him deeper into the abyss. Marcus's screams echoed into the void as the darkness swallowed him whole. He fell endlessly, the black stone in his hand pulsing with a cold, rhythmic energy that seemed to sap the strength from his body. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the fall ended. He landed on something soft. A carpet? His head swam as he struggled to his feet, the world around him still cloaked in darkness. Slowly, faint light filtered in, revealing the edges of a room he recognized. It was the hotel lobby, but not as he'd seen it before. The once vibrant space was decayed and warped, its walls covered in blackened vines and cracks that oozed a strange, tar-like substance. The grand chandelier hung crookedly, its crystals dull and coated in grime. Marcus clutched the box and stone tightly, his breath catching as a familiar voice whispered behind him. "Welcome back," it said. He spun around, but the lobby was empty. The voice, soft, feminine, and laced with malice, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have touched it," the voice continued, growing louder. "You don't even know what you've unleashed." Marcus turned in frantic circles, searching for the source. Shadows danced along the edges of the room, moving with unnatural fluidity. Then a door appeared, a tall, ornate door that hadn't been there before. It opened with a low creak, revealing a long hallway lined with portraits. Marcus hesitated, but the box seemed to tug at him, urging him forward. As he stepped into the hallway, The portraits seemed to come alive, their painted eyes following his every move. Each one depicted a different person. A man in a business suit, a maid in a starched uniform, a young girl clutching a teddy bear. And yet, all their faces bore the same haunted expression. Hollow eyes, twisted mouths, and a sense of despair so tangible it made Marcus's chest ache. "What is this place?" he whispered, his voice trembling. At the end of the hallway stood another mirror, taller and more ornate than the ones he'd seen before. Its surface was clouded, but as Marcus approached, an image began to take shape. It was the young woman again, her wild eyes staring back at him. She stood in a small, dimly lit room, her hands bound and her face streaked with tears. "Why are you showing me this?" Marcus asked, his voice breaking. The woman's expression darkened, and her voice echoed through the hallway. "They didn't listen, and now you must pay for their sins." The image in the mirror shifted, showing Marcus himself. But this wasn't the man he knew. This version of him looked gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and his face twisted with fear. "You cannot escape it," the woman said. "The box is a key, but it's also a cage." Before Marcus could respond, the mirror shattered, and the hallway plunged into darkness. When the light returned, Marcus found himself standing in a familiar place, the basement room where the woman had been imprisoned. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls were covered in the same strange symbols that adorned the box. In the center of the room stood the chair, its metal chains hanging limply. As Marcus approached, the chains sprang to life, lashing out and wrapping around his wrists and ankles. He cried out, struggling against their grip, but they held him fast. The shadows in the room coalesced into a figure, the same towering, featureless shadow that had haunted him before. "You bear her burden now," it intoned, its voice a low growl. "Her pain is your pain. Her curse is your curse." The black stone in Marcus's hand grew impossibly cold, and he screamed as a searing pain shot through his chest. Images flooded his mind, visions of the woman's torment, the men who had betrayed her, and the endless cycle of suffering that had ensnared them all. When the chains released him, Marcus collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The shadow loomed over him, its presence suffocating. "What do you want from me?" Marcus demanded, his voice hoarse. The shadow extended a formless hand, pointing to the box. "You are the keeper. You will carry the curse, and you will ensure it is passed to the next." Marcus's blood ran cold. "What does that mean?" The shadow didn't answer, but the walls around him began to shift, revealing scenes of those who had come before him, previous keepers who had been trapped by the box's curse. He saw a maid clutching the box as she fled through the hotel, only to be consumed by the shadows. A businessman attempting to sell the land, his body found days later in a locked room. A young couple, their faces pale and lifeless as they lay side by side in bed. "They tried to escape," the shadow said. "They failed." Marcus's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He didn't want this, didn't want to be a part of the cycle. But the weight of the box in his hands told him there was no choice. "You can't force me to do this," he said, his voice shaking. "There has to be another way." The shadow's laughter filled the room, cold and mocking. "There is no other way. The curse binds you. You will carry it until it consumes you, or until you find another." The air grew colder, and the shadows began to close in. Marcus clutched the box tightly, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly in the dim light. "I'll fight it," he whispered to himself. "I won't let it win." But even as he spoke, he felt the weight of the curse pressing down on him, a relentless force that seemed impossible to escape. The walls around him dissolved, and Marcus found himself back in the hotel lobby. But this time it was alive with movement. Ghostly figures flitted through the space, their faces blurred and indistinct. He recognized some of them from the portraits in the hallway, the businessman, the maid, the young girl. They moved with a sense of purpose, but their expressions were vacant, as though they were trapped in some endless loop. The young woman's voice echoed in his mind. "They're all part of it now, just like you." Marcus turned, his heart pounding as he saw her standing at the base of the grand staircase. Her eyes burned with anger, but there was something else in them, a glimmer of sorrow. "You can't fight it," she said. "You can only survive it." As she spoke, the black stone in Marcus's hand began to glow, its cold surface warming until it burned his skin. He cried out, dropping it to the floor. The light from the stone spread, illuminating the lobby in a sickly green glow. The ghostly figures turned to face him, their empty eyes locking onto his. The woman's voice grew louder, filling the space. The cycle must continue. Before Marcus could react, a door appeared on the far side of the lobby. It was different from the others, tall, imposing, and carved with the same symbols that adorned the box. The shadows seemed to pull him toward it, their cold grip wrapping around his ankles and dragging him forward. He resisted, clawing at the floor, but the force was too strong. The ghostly figures surrounded him, their voices rising in a mournful chorus. As the door swung open, Marcus caught a glimpse of what lay beyond. A swirling abyss of darkness, punctuated by flashes of blinding light. And then he was pulled through. The swirling abyss beyond the carved door was a void of chaos. Marcus felt as though he were being stretched, pulled apart by the conflicting forces within. Time seemed to have no meaning. One moment stretched into eternity, and then collapsed into a single heartbeat. When the pulling sensation stopped, he was standing in a place unlike anything he had ever seen. The space was infinite, a sprawling landscape of dark, twisting corridors that seemed to stretch into nothingness. The air was dense, oppressive, and filled with the low hum of unseen energy. Walls loomed in every direction, carved from the same black stone as the box. In the distance, faint whispers drifted through the air, just barely audible. Marcus clutched his chest, where a lingering coldness reminded him of the curse's grip. He glanced at his hands and saw faint marks etched into his skin, the same symbols that covered the box and the room. "You shouldn't have come," a voice hissed. Marcus turned quickly, his pulse spiking. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a tall, gaunt man with pale skin and hollow eyes. He was dressed in an old-fashioned bellhop uniform, the faded gold trim glinting in the dim light. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded, backing away. The man tilted his head, a hollow smile creeping across his face. "I'm no one important, just a guide of sorts." "Guide? For what?" "For this place," the man said, gesturing to the endless corridors. "And for you, Keeper. You'll need help if you want to survive." Marcus shook his head. "I don't want to survive. I want to end this. How do I break the curse?" The man's laughter echoed, sharp and unsettling. "End it? Oh, my dear Keeper, there is no ending. Only continuation. The box must always have a keeper." Marcus clenched his fists. "Then I'll destroy it." The man's smile faded. "You can try. But the box is older than you, older than this place. It's tied to the fabric of everything you see. Destroying it would destroy much more." The man gestured for Marcus to follow him. Reluctantly, Marcus complied, keeping a wary eye on his strange guide. They walked down one of the twisting corridors, the whispers growing louder with every step. Marcus began to discern words within the whispers. Pleas, cries for help, and anguished screams. "What is this place?" Marcus asked. The guide glanced back at him. "The in-between, a space where the keeper learns their role, where you're shaped by the curse." Marcus frowned. "Why me? Why was I chosen?" "You weren't chosen," the guide said flatly. "You stumbled into it just like all the others. That's how it works. The curse finds those who are vulnerable." Marcus bristled. "I'm not vulnerable," the guide chuckled. "A man running from his past, looking for a fresh start? The box feeds on pain, guilt, and regret. You were perfect." They reached a fork in the corridor, and the guide paused. He gestured to the left path, where faint lights flickered. "This way. There's something you need to see." The whispers grew louder as they walked, forming a haunting melody that set Marcus's teeth on edge. The corridor widened into a vast chamber, its walls lined with mirrors. But these were no ordinary mirrors. They reflected scenes from Marcus's life. He saw himself as a child, crying as his father stormed out of the house. Another mirror showed him arguing with his ex-girlfriend. Her face streaked with tears as she shouted something he couldn't quite hear. One by one, the mirrors revealed every regret, every failure, every moment of pain he'd tried to bury. "Stop!" Marcus shouted, turning away from the reflections. "I don't need to see this." The guide watched him impassively. "You can't run from it, Keeper. The box feeds on this. Your pain is its lifeblood." The air in the chamber grew colder, and the mirrors began to fog over. A familiar presence filled the room. The towering shadow, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. "You cannot escape," it intoned, its voice rumbling like distant thunder. "The curse binds you, Keeper." Marcus stood his ground, though his legs trembled. "Why me? Why not someone else?" The shadow leaned closer, its featureless face mere inches from Marcus's. "Because you were there. Because you opened the door. Now you are the door." Marcus swallowed hard, the weight of the words sinking in. "The door to what?" The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it reached out, its dark tendrils wrapping around Marcus's chest. The cold seeped into his skin, and his vision blurred as the chamber dissolved around him. When Marcus's vision cleared, he was standing in a room that felt strangely familiar. It was the hotel, but not as he'd seen it before. Everything was pristine, untouched by the decay that had consumed the rest of the building. In the center of the room sat a woman, the same woman from the mirror. She looked younger, her face unmarked by the sorrow and rage he'd seen before. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, his voice soft. The woman looked up, her eyes filled with an aching sadness. "I was like you once, Keeper, but I couldn't bear it. I let the curse consume me." Marcus took a step closer. "How do I stop it? How do I break the cycle?" The woman shook her head. "You can't break it, but you can control it. The box's power is tied to this place, to the hotel. If you learn to harness it, you can keep it contained." Marcus frowned. "And if I don't?" Her expression darkened. "Then the shadows will spread. The curse will consume everything." The woman stood, her form flickering like a candle flame. "You have a choice, Marcus. Embrace your role as keeper and protect the world from the curse. Or let it consume you, and doom everyone to the darkness." Marcus stared at her, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He didn't want this. He didn't want any of it. But the memory of the box's power, the way it had called to him, the way it had twisted the hotel, was impossible to ignore. "Why me?" he whispered again, his voice breaking. The woman reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Because you're strong enough to bear it. Even if you don't believe it yet." Before Marcus could respond, the room began to dissolve, the woman's form fading into the shadows. "You're not alone," her voice echoed. "But you must choose. The next door awaits." Marcus found himself back in the corridor, the box still clutched tightly in his hand. Ahead of him, another door appeared. This one smaller, less ornate, but still carved with the same haunting symbols. The whispers grew louder, urging him forward. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stepped toward the door, his resolve hardening. Whatever lay beyond, he would face it. And he would find a way to end this, no matter the cost. Marcus stood in front of the door, his hand hovering above the worn brass handle. The whispers, now sharp and insistent, seemed to claw at his ears. He could feel the weight of their urgency, the need to push him forward, to urge him to make a choice he wasn't sure he was ready for. He glanced back, unsure whether to look for any sign of the woman, or for some sign that he wasn't truly alone in this endless maze. But there was nothing, just the walls, the faint hum of energy coursing through the air, and the oppressive silence that followed his every move. With a deep breath, he gripped the handle. The door creaked open with a sound that made his spine stiffen. A rush of cold air swept through, carrying with it the faint, familiar stench of decay. As he stepped inside, the room revealed itself in jagged bursts of fading light, like a half-remembered nightmare. The floor was covered in dust, and thick webs clung to the corners. But more unsettling than the decaying state of the room was the feeling that this place didn't belong here. It was out of place, a fragment torn from some other reality and stitched into the fabric of the hotel. There, in the center of the room, stood a massive mirror. Its frame was cracked, ornate carvings etched into the dark wood, symbols, much like the ones that adorned the box and the carved doors. But the glass was different. It wasn't reflecting anything that existed in the room. Instead, it seemed to shimmer, warping as though it were a portal into something else. Marcus hesitated. He didn't know what he expected to see in that reflection, but the gnawing instinct at the back of his mind told him to stay away. But he was already too far in. The whispers grew louder, more distinct now, echoing like voices from a distant place. Marcus stepped closer, the air around him growing colder as his hand instinctively reached out toward the mirror. As his fingers brushed the glass, the reflection inside shifted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it seemed like a blurry shadow, a vague outline of a figure. But then it sharpened, revealing the unmistakable features of a woman. Tall, with dark hair that cascaded around her face. She was staring directly at him, her expression filled with a strange mix of recognition and accusation. Marcus recoiled, his heart hammering in his chest. The woman's lips moved, forming words he couldn't quite make out. "Stop," she whispered, her voice low, strained. "Don't open the door." He froze. His own reflection, pale and wide-eyed, stared back at him, but it was him and yet not. The figure in the glass looked just slightly off, as if some subtle detail was wrong. "Who are you?" Marcus breathed, but the woman in the mirror didn't answer. Instead, her gaze shifted over his shoulder, and her mouth moved again. This time, Marcus could hear the words clearly. "Behind you." Cold hands gripped Marcus's shoulders before he could turn around. His breath caught in his throat, his blood turning to ice as he was pulled backward, his feet dragging across the floor. The air in the room grew thick with an oppressive darkness, as though the very walls were closing in on him. The whispers intensified into guttural growls, a sound that scraped against his bones, making every nerve scream in terror. The shadow, there was no mistaking it now, had returned, larger and more menacing than ever before. The thing behind him was no longer a distant presence but something close, something that filled the room with its cold, suffocating presence. His form seemed to warp and flicker, always shifting, always changing. Marcus gasped for air, struggling against the unseen grip that held him in place. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. His body refused to obey him. He could feel the shadow's breath on the back of his neck, like a cold wind from a grave. A voice, low, raspy, and full of hunger, whispered in his ear. "You can't run from me, Keeper. You belong to me now." The mirror's surface rippled, and Marcus's gaze snapped back to it. The woman's face had disappeared, replaced by an image of the hotel, just as it had been before the decay had taken hold. People moved through the halls, laughing and chatting, blissfully unaware of the horrors lurking beneath. But then the image shifted, and the warmth of the scene turned to ice. The walls of the hotel began to crack, the laughter fading into agonized screams. Figures, blurred, indistinct, appeared, their hands reaching out in desperation. Suddenly, one of the figures solidified, becoming clearer, more distinct. It was her, the woman from the mirror. But this time she was older. Her eyes were filled with terror, and her lips moved silently. The scene in the mirror shifted again, this time showing a burning pyre, flames licking the sky. The woman, now a condemned prisoner, stood at its base, her arms bound. Her eyes were filled with hatred and sorrow as the crowd around her jeered. The truth sank into Marcus's mind like a stone in water. The woman had been wronged, executed for crimes she hadn't committed. The curse that followed had bound her spirit to this place, and now Marcus. He too was trapped in the same endless cycle. The shadow loomed over him, growing larger with each passing moment. Its voice echoed in his mind, twisting his thoughts. "The box is a link, a key," it murmured. "You will serve as keeper. You will be the one to open the doors, to release us. And in return, you will gain what you desire most." Marcus clenched his fists. "I don't want anything from you," he growled, his voice hoarse from the pressure in his chest. "I don't care about the curse. I don't care about the box." The shadow's laughter shook the room. "You already care. You always have. You came here seeking answers, and now you will find them. But be warned, Keeper. There is a price for everything." Marcus felt a shiver run through him as the temperature dropped. His heart raced, and his pulse thudded in his ears. The shadow's form took on a new shape, no longer a swirling mass of darkness, but a distinct figure, one that resembled Marcus himself, though distorted and twisted. "You're me," Marcus whispered, his voice faltering. "Yes," the shadow crooned. "And I am you. We are one and the same. And the choice, Keeper, is yours." The figure in the mirror flickered again, and Marcus's vision blurred. The room seemed to warp around him, the walls stretching, the air thickening. A faint glimmer of light appeared at the far end of the room. A door. Marcus staggered toward it, the shadow's mocking laughter echoing behind him. The whispers grew louder, filling his head with promises, with threats. But Marcus knew now that his only chance to escape, to put an end to this nightmare, was through that door. But as his hand reached for the handle, the shadow's voice called out, full of malice. "You can't run, Keeper. You can't hide. You belong to me now." The door creaked open, revealing a blinding light that swallowed everything. Marcus, the shadow, the hotel, the curse. As Marcus stepped into the blinding light, he felt the pull of the shadow behind him, a relentless force that refused to let him go. The door slammed shut behind him with an unnatural force, trapping him in the pure radiance. He could feel his heartbeat thundering in his chest, the air around him thick with an indescribable pressure, as though the very fabric of reality were unraveling. For a moment, everything was silent. The whispers ceased, the shadow's presence faded, and the weight of the cursed room was lifted. But it didn't last. The light grew more intense, until Marcus could no longer keep his eyes open. He stumbled forward, his legs unsteady beneath him, his mind filled with the eerie stillness of the unknown. Then, a figure emerged from the light, a woman, one he recognized instantly. It was her, the woman from the mirror, the one who had been executed all those years ago. Her expression was no longer filled with sorrow, but with something else, something darker. "Do you know what you've done?" she asked, her voice soft yet haunting. Marcus tried to speak, but his throat felt dry. He was too overwhelmed, too terrified to form words. All he could do was nod. "I was wronged," she continued, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer. "And now you are the one who must pay the price. But there is a way to end this." Her form flickered for a moment, and Marcus could feel the weight of her words sinking in. The curse was still alive, lingering, and it had been passed on to him. He had awakened something ancient and vengeful, and now it wanted justice. But she wasn't finished. "I can give you a choice," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You can walk away, live your life, and leave this place forever. But know this, the curse will continue. It will pass to someone else, someone innocent, and it will keep spreading. Or you can stay. You can take my place, and in doing so, the curse will die with you. You will become the Keeper. Forever." Marcus felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew what she was asking. To take her place would mean an eternity of suffering, of being bound to this cursed hotel, this room, forever. To walk away meant condemning someone else to the same fate he had endured. But was it truly a choice? The woman's figure began to fade as the light around them grew dimmer, more distorted. She was leaving, vanishing into the ether. "I will give you one last chance, Marcus," she said, her voice lingering in the fading light. "Choose wisely, or you will never leave this place." The room seemed to warp again, and Marcus felt a crushing weight on his chest. He glanced around. This place wasn't the hotel anymore. It was something else, something between worlds. The air felt thick with the stench of death and decay. Shadows shifted at the edges of his vision, and the oppressive feeling of being watched returned. He could feel the shadow creeping closer, its breath cold against his skin. The final decision was upon him. The weight of the curse, the responsibility of being the keeper, was overwhelming. And yet, Marcus knew that if he didn't act, the cycle would never end. With a final, shaky breath, Marcus made his choice. Marcus stepped forward, his heart heavy, and closed his eyes, surrendering to the curse. As soon as he made the decision, the room around him seemed to collapse, folding in on itself like a dying star. The air was thick with darkness, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, until they swallowed everything. When Marcus opened his eyes again, he was back in the hotel. But something was different. The walls were cracked and broken, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The shadows were no longer just at the corners of his vision. They were tangible, clawing at the edges of his mind. And standing before him, in the very center of the room, was the woman. Her eyes were no longer filled with sorrow, but with a twisted satisfaction. "It's done," she whispered. "The curse is broken." But Marcus didn't feel free. No, he felt something else. He felt the weight of the curse settle over him, pressing him into the ground, binding him to this place forever. "I am the keeper," he whispered, his voice hollow, empty. "Forever." And as the woman faded into the darkness, Marcus stood alone in the room that no one should ever have entered. The door that led to freedom was closed, locked by the very curse he had chosen to accept. And as the shadows closed in, he realized with a chilling certainty that his story was just beginning.